really talking about initially is what he called the ideological echo chamber. And I have picked out some of the bits from it because there was a kind of big political context and discussions about diversity and diversity initiatives as well. But the key thing that he talked about that I'm going to address is that on average, men and women biologically differ in many ways. And I'm actually going to talk about what on average means, as well as the kind of biological aspect. He talked about the distribution of preferences and abilities. Now, I think that's quite interesting, and that's actually something which came up in Maria's talk earlier. We're kind of moving on from the idea that maybe we're looking at some kind of differential inabilities. Maybe women really don't have what it takes. And people have been looking for that for a long time. And there's more and more research coming out talking about gender similarities rather than differences. So that the focus has kind of shifted now onto talking about preferences and attitudes. Maybe this is why there are few women in particular branches of science and in science as a whole. This other kind of meme, this stronger interest in people rather than things, again comes up all the time. It came up in the Google memo. I think it was mentioned last week in the rant about women in physics. And actually what I want to look at is what that actually means and how is it measured. Because I think maybe, as hopefully good scientists, we should say, let's have a look at the measure of this, the metric, how this was, rather than just hand-wavy, oh, people are more interested in, women are more interested in people, let's find out what that really means. And there's a whole issue also about sort of personality differences and women being higher in neuroticism, for example, and that's why they will never do very well in high-stress environments like Google. Okay, just really 30 minutes, haven't got very long, to kind of knock the idea on the head that we really are looking at differences. Because if we look at the kind of effect sizes that we're talking about in sex differences, even people who attack the kind of claim that women have just as much right to be in science as men will agree that we're looking at hugely overlapping distributions of scores on any kind of measure. So generally they are very small. Now, people will say even very small differences can multiply into big effects, and when you take into account all other variables, then maybe this is why we've got this difference. But generally, we're talking about something that's very small. And that's something which doesn't actually really leak out into the kind of public conception of what we're talking about. And I think that's important too in communicating these ideas, because as I'll be talking about, the whole kind of stereotypical view of science actually has a very profound effect on who does science and why, and who doesn't do science and why, even at the brain level. So I think it's quite important that those kind of issues are aired. And I just quickly drew together some of the debates which have been going on. Very recent, huge meta-analysis by Janet Hyde, where she looked at the kind of well-established, in inverted commas, differences between skills in males and females, as well as personalities, well in attitudes as well, and said that if you look at these data really carefully, not only now, but as they've changed over time, what we're really looking at is the fact that men are more similar. Men and women are more similar than they are different. And if you were interested in variability, look within the population. And as I'll talk a bit about later, maybe we should actually get away from this whole gender lens altogether. Similarly, other data which actually did a meta-analysis of meta-analyses, so huge numbers of studies, came out with the finding that actually these differences are so small, they really are difficult to take into account. And this was a statement by Barnett and Rivers in response to the Google memo, saying that they'd actually been looking at issues of gender and STEM for 25 years, really couldn't find any evidence to support the kind of statements he was making. So it looks as though what he was claiming was fundamentally flawed. And the other thing that he didn't mention, which I've taken issue with, is that actually even if, and that is a big, inverted commas and underlined, even if there is evidence of some kind of biological imbalance in terms of the skills that are needed to have a career in science, to succeed in science, even if that was the case, we now know that the brain is very, very moldable, very plastic. And if there are kind of differences like spatial cognition, which is one that's very often wheeled out as one of the most robust differences between males and females, actually it isn't. If you train the brain to do different tasks, you can find these differences will disappear and the performance levels will change as well. So even if there was some kind of biological difference, there is not, which is the underlying theme of these kind of attacks, it's not fixed, it's not inevitable, it's not natural, and therefore shouldn't be messed around with. So I think that is something that he got wrong, that he didn't address that. He kind of said, well, there are biological differences, without specifically saying that that's therefore means that we shouldn't mess around with them. Google shouldn't be running these kind of diversity programs, etc. Okay, so let's have a look at this people versus things, because it is very common. And I've just finished writing a book, in fact, in which I reviewed some of the metrics which are used for addressing these kind of issues. And the people versus things is really very interesting because it comes up a lot and it's taken as a given. But if you actually look at the way in which, what that actually means, the way in which this particular dimension was generated, it was way back in 1980s, it first came up as somebody who was working for the American college testing program. It was really about career choices, vocational interests, etc. And what he actually did was a huge undertaking. I think he looked at 500 odd different professions, different skills, different levels of jobs. And he actually rated what went on in those tasks in terms of a variety of different dimensions, two of which were things and people. So he said, have a look at these tasks, let's decide what's in those tasks we could call thing-like, what's in those tasks we could call people-like. And so he said that non-thing-like tasks involve machines, materials, tools, biological mechanisms, which, as we'll see later, is a bit like systemizing thinking. People tasks, interpersonal tasks such as caring for, persuading, entertaining, or directing others, including animals treated as if they were human. I'm not quite sure why he put that in there. What he then did was he then looked at a huge number of different careers and said, let's have a look at which of those careers are thing-like and which of those careers are people-like. And he came up with these kind of dimensions so we can decide which careers are thing-like and which things are people-like. What I actually did was I looked, at the time he was writing in the 1980s, I looked at the gender balance within these kind of tasks, you know, like the bricklayers and the bus drivers and the elementary school teachers and the social workers. And one of the things he found was that what he was actually looking at were jobs which were already gendered. So there were already about 82% of elementary school teachers were female, 63% of social workers were female, so he's nominated those as people tasks, whereas only 29% of bus drivers at that point were female, and only 2.4% of bricklayers were female. So this was back in the 1980s. The point I'm trying to make is that what he was actually looking at were jobs that were already being done by males or females. So in terms of talking about people or things, what he was actually looking at was really jobs that are done by women and jobs that are done by men. Now, before, you know, maybe this is something we can talk about in the round table later. Maybe they were doing those jobs because they were interested in them and they, you know, responded to their particular techniques, although actually legally women weren't allowed to be bus drivers in England anyway till about 1970s. So there were those issues as well. So that's important to remember, because what you then get is, isn't it amazing? We've got all these different careers. We ask women what jobs they'd like to do, and they all come up with these people-like jobs, and the men all come up with these thing-like jobs. But that actual metric was based on something which was already in place. So I think that's important to bear in mind, because it's something which gets produced a lot, and I think was produced last week as well. It was also another aspect of this when, irrespective of what kind of careers or vocations people had, another psychologist came up with a way of looking at just asking people the kind of thing they might like to do. And this was, again, a metric developed in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the kind of thing that you might be interested in doing. And so the kind of questions we had there were, would you be interested in, you know, making the first attempt to meet a new neighbour? Would you be interested in taking apart and trying to reassemble a desktop computer? Would you be interested in exploring the ocean floor in a one-person submarine? Whole range of jobs like that. And again, what they came up with is that women score high on the people interests and men score high on the thing interests. But actually, if you look at the kind of tasks that they're using for that, I mean, again, this was the 1970s. I don't know if there were many women exploring the ocean floor in a one-person submarine. But, you know, it could be something that, again, we should look at. So challenge the metric, which I think is something which is really important. Again, he mentioned the terms of people and things, and he said, which is like empathizing and systemizing, which is a sort of fairly well-known psychological dimension, which was introduced in the early, about 2008, 2009 by Simon Baron-Cohen, who is, what he talked about was the truth about the male and female brain, which is something we probably need to challenge anyway. And he called it the essential difference, which actually is quite an interesting title, because it was in terms of essence, the essence of being male or the essence of being female. But of course, the impression you get is that this is actually something which is something that you should have, as this kind of difference. So he very clearly stated right at the beginning, the female brain is predominantly hardwired for empathy. The male brain is predominantly hardwired for understanding and building systems. Now, De Moore did a kind of direct parallel between the people and things and empathy and systemizing, which again, people in those different careers might like to challenge themselves and say, you know, why do you think that, you know, if I'm a physicist, I'm not empathic, etc. What he also said, and that sometimes gets forgotten, your sex does not dictate your brain type. Not all men have the male brain, and not all women have the female brain. And I think that gets lost in translation a lot. And when you think about it, you think, so why are you calling it a male brain? Why are you calling it a female brain? And I think, again, this is something, language matters. The labels you use matters, particularly when we're addressing a contentious issue like this. And I think possibly one of the most, long-standing, certainly, and pernicious myths that we have is there is such a thing as the male brain and the female brain. So, I mean, I think there are issues there which we need to address. I've been given the 10-minute warning, so I shall move on quickly. The other thing that he addressed was this whole issue of what we call this paradox, whereby if you look at sex differences, in this case in personality, in the big five, across 55 different cultures, in countries which had the smallest gender gaps, did better on the gender equality index, there were bigger differences between males and females. Now, this was interpreted as, in this kind of environment, women and men can naturally diverge. They can express their innate personality differences in a different way. And the reason I'm emphasizing that, I'll come on to in the next slide, because, again, you know, the language has shifted a bit. We're saying this is a choice that people can make. You know, interestingly, they talk about personality, which, again, is something we could talk about. But what's more interesting, particularly in terms of what Maria was saying earlier, is what's now known as the gender equality paradox, where again, it's a big paper just published where they looked at, in 63 different countries, they looked at the enrollment in STEM at various levels, and they looked at the gender gap index. And what they found was that the narrower the gender gap index, in other words, the more, in theory, the more gender equality there was in a country, the bigger the differences there were, or the bigger imbalance in STEM involvement. Now, this was something which has caused a lot of interest. And the differences emerged from a seemingly rational choice to pursue academic paths that were personal strength. The main story of this was that if you looked at the girls in these particular studies, they measured all their particular academic strengths. And they found that although the girls and the boys were pretty well matched for science skills, so as I said earlier, it didn't look as though there was any kind of major imbalance in terms of ability, what they did find was that lots of the girls were much better at what they called arts and humanities, better at reading. It's an interesting kind of thing to focus on. And what the girls then did was they then went off and painting and drawing came into it. But they went off and chose subjects which they were good at, and that's why they went into arts and humanities. So the unspoken assumption is that they have taken a seemingly rational choice. They've decided not to do science. Now, just in the remaining time I've got, I'll quickly have a look at what that might mean. And this is where I need to introduce a new way of looking at the brain, talking about the social brain. A lot of neuroscience, which I've been involved in myself, has been focusing very much on the wonders of the human brain, in that it can do maths and physics and language and art, high-level cognitive skills. But it's starting to emerge that actually perhaps one of the reasons that human beings are successful as they are is because they're social, they cooperate, they work in teams. And what we're looking at is things like those parts of the brain which are very much involved in our self-esteem, our self-image, our self-identity. very much involved in the frontal areas there, the most recently evolved evolutionarily speaking. Way back in the brain here is the kind of emotional areas, which are what in a sports psychology paradigm, somebody's called the inner chimp. So we all have our kind of emotional person who will, the will to win, etc. But what's interesting for me is this kind of bridge here between the two, where there's a kind of part of the brain which is very much involved in negotiating, if you like, between the cool analytical part of the brain and the emotional part of the brain. And one of the things that this part of the brain does, and this is something, I could talk about for a long time, but I won't, Gonzalo will be pleased to hear me say, is that it's something which actually stops behavior. It's mainly an inhibitory role. So if things aren't going right, and if your social antennae are appropriately tuned, you're constantly monitoring, should I be doing that? Should I be doing this? And if the conclusion is not a very good idea, generally you will retreat from the situation, you withdraw, whatever the behavior is that you will stop. Okay, so supposing, I'm a girl with, high scores in English and high scores in physics, and I think, where shall I choose to go? Very important social context. How welcoming is science to females? And this, again, I won't go over it in detail, but it's the kind of thing that people may well be aware of, that the kind of study where members of the science faculty were given identical CVs with Jennifer at the top of one and John at the top of the other, and they were asked if they would appoint this person, what kind of mentoring scheme they'd put in place, what kind of training they would offer them. And as you'll probably guess, a much higher proportion of people chose the John CV for encouragement in terms of their progress in science. Similarly, sorry, I'm going backwards now. Similarly, we found that, can I go back? Yes. The kind of letters of recommendation that are given to people entering science faculty are very different depending on whether they're recommendations for males or females. And interestingly, in that we're in the Lisa Meitner lecture theatre, I actually looked up Lisa Meitner in terms of, what people might think of her as a role model. Does anybody know that the Nobel Prize Committee have just released the nomination statistics for the last 50 years? And in terms of how important role models are, in terms of whether somebody might choose to come into a particular discipline. Lisa Meitner was actually nominated for the Physics Nobel Prize 27 times, and for the Chemistry Nobel Prize 19 times. And as you probably know, she didn't get it. So there's a kind of message out there somehow we might be looking at. The other thing that we're looking at, this isn't a direct social rejection. We do know that parts of the brain, particularly the parts of the brain which are associated with inhibitory responses, respond quite powerfully to social rejection. In fact, it's been shown that social rejection actually activates the same parts of the brain as real physical pain activates. So actually being rejected or excluded feels quite painful, literally. And it may be that, most people, evolutionarily speaking, will avoid painful situations. And this was apparently a Tinder type task where you swipe right or swipe left. I believe that's what you do. And so they set it up within the scanner, and they showed that the areas of the brain were activated when you were rejected were these parts of the brain here. There's the anterior cingulate here, which is that bridge that I talked about, which is our kind of inhibitory processing. So, being in a climate where you're not really welcome does actually change how the brain works. And this is something which the social psychologists have looked at in some detail. And again, I won't go into it in detail. This concept here of rejection sensitivity, they've actually looked at individuals who are who enter situations where they're very anxious about succeeding, the kind of imposter syndrome type approach, where they feel that actually they don't belong and they've got to be really careful not to make any mistakes. And what they've tracked is that you can score individuals in terms of their rejection sensitivity. You can then measure the level of engagement they have in this case, an academic environment. If they, how many of them drop out of the course they're doing, how many of them fail to take up offers of additional tutorial support, how many of them report extreme anxiety and poor performance in their particular discipline. In this case, this was looking at the way in which women in very imbalanced environments have a much higher level of concern about being rejected, and it can change how their brain works. So I'm putting together quite a lot of different sorts of stories here. I won't go into that in detail. It's similarly where you think you are in the pecking order. So rather than this is actually looking at socioeconomic status. If you ask somebody where you think you are in the pecking order, this again is demonstrated at the brain level. There can be a change in if you feel that you're not likely to go very high up the status charts. Now, I talked before, and people will be familiar with this whole concept of the fact that we have a view of scientists which is not necessarily gender balanced. There's a view of scientists needing this kind of expectation of brilliance, and that brilliance is some kind of innate factor, and those disciplines which have the strongest belief in this innate factor are the ones with the biggest gender imbalances. But I've also been looking at children, very young children, in terms of where this comes from. When does this start? Is this just something which comes with adults? And I came across this really interesting, it is quite old, but it's quite telling, I think. So there's a questionnaire, I think there were about 5,000 children asked, if you were going to be a scientist, you had to write an essay, I should like to be the kind of scientist who? Okay, so that question was actually asked to the boys. The girls got this question, if you were going to marry a scientist, I should like to marry the kind of scientist who? Okay, so it was the 1950s, so things of course have changed a lot since then. Actually, I think, you probably get the message that quite a lot hasn't. So if you look at, for example, the drawings, it's quite a nice way of accessing children's view of who a scientist is. Very often, this is quite advanced, actually. Normally, you certainly get the lab coat normally, almost invariably male, and quite often wild hair or no hair and a beard. And certainly there's some studies done in the last 5 years where this is shifting a bit, which is good news, but it's still, out there in the environment. And similarly, very young children here, 6 and 7-year-olds, these were, just to speed up, they were children who were offered the choice of a toy or a game which was for really, really smart people. And what they found was that the boys were much more likely to choose to play this game than girls. Girls already thought, well, if this is really for very, very smart people, probably not for me. These were 6-year-olds, okay? Something to think about. We've talked a bit about the whole idea of stereotype, and this is a slide I've shown to some of you before. The idea that if you present the same task in a different way, this is a task that women do well at, this is a task that men do well at, or this is a task that women don't do well at. What you'll find is that the ones who get the positive message make fewest mistakes, ones who get the negative message make more mistakes, but what you also get is differences in how the brain processes that information. So that the individuals who are told, this is a visuospatial task that women are really good at, the appropriate areas of the brain are activated, they solve the spatial task efficiently. Women who are told exactly the same task, this is one that women do struggle with, but do your best. Different parts of the brain are activated, much more to do with our friend the anterior cingulate. They make many more mistakes, and they stop trying the task sooner. How many minutes have I got? Three, okay. Again, these are the kind of things that we're looking at in terms of stereotype threat. If you put somebody in a situation, this is actually a maths task, very complicated, so I won't go into details, but 4 different groups of people. Some of them were individuals who were struggling a bit, the poor learners, and they were divided into 4 groups, and some of them were given a kind of stereotype threat message, and it was an ongoing task where you did the task, given a certain amount of time, you were then given feedback, then you went on to the next bit of the task. If you started failing, you could either stop or you could be offered a chance to go off and do a tutorial. And they found that individuals in the stereotype threat condition were much more activated by negative feedback. They paid much more attention to the negative feedback. They were much more likely to stop the task that they were doing, and they were much less likely to take up any offers of additional support. Might sound familiar to some of you, but again, the area of the brain that was activated, which this is measuring, is our friend the anterior cingulate again. And similarly, the same kind of story, that if you give somebody a same task, say this task is diagnostic of your maths intelligence, or this task is diagnostic of the type of problem-solving strategies you prefer, you find that this group make many more mistakes, and there's much more activity in this kind of bridging part of the brain here. Whereas this group are activating the appropriate areas in the brain and making fewer mistakes. So what I'm trying to say is that in terms of biological differences, actually, this is what he nearly got right. There probably are biological differences, but they're not something which is innate. They're something which culture has imbued and gradually changed the way in which our brain processes information. A variety of things you can do, and I think I might talk more about these this afternoon. You can find ways of overcoming this. You can give people messages of success, of empowerment, which will, when you then put them in the kind of situation where they showed the stereotype, threat and anxiety, it will change the way in which they behave. They will do better with a particular task, and this part of the brain is activated. And I'm obviously showing you it because it's the anterior cingulate. So we can actually change the brain in a particular way to change the outcome, which appears to be affecting this gender imbalance that we're talking about. The other thing that we can do is resolve the paradox, fix the culture of science, not have that kind of message that this is what you should be doing. There are initiatives in the UK, for example, where the Women in Science and Engineering group are actually addressing directly this whole issue of people like me, of girls choosing not to do science because they don't think science is for them. So what they're doing is matching personality profiles to profiles of 12 different sorts of scientists and saying, that's interesting you're like that, because this is the kind of scientist you could be. And that is proving very effective. So I think we want to get away from this, I'm too pretty to do math, to hopefully forget princess, I want to be a scientist. Okay. And just to, I was told I could quickly plug this. I've actually just finished writing a book called The Gendered Brain, and a major theme in that is the way in which this interaction between the culture of science and our brains is actually producing the kind of imbalances we're talking about. Thank you, I've gone on too long, sorry.